When my husband's old friend Edward appeared at my bedroom doorway that quiet afternoon, I never expected the look in his eyes to stir something long forgotten in me, something warm, unsettling, and deeply human. What followed wasn't scandal, but a moment of unexpected connection that made me question how well I truly knew myself. Don't forget subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. I was sitting on the edge of my bed when it happened, the kind of lazy Sunday afternoon where the air feels soft and the house holds its breath. My husband had stepped out to run errands, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the late-day sun stretching across the hardwood floor. I had been sorting through a drawer of old scarves, trying to decide which ones to donate, when I heard a gentle knock on the doorframe. "Angela?" I looked up, and there stood Edward. It had been months since I'd last seen him, my husband's childhood friend with the kind eyes and the kind of thoughtful silence that always made me feel oddly at ease. He lived across town, but stopped by every now and then to help my husband with the sort of house repairs I could never pretend to understand. But today, he wasn't expected. For a moment, I was too surprised to speak. Edward wasn't the type to appear unannounced. He leaned one shoulder casually against the frame, as if he had all the time in the world, and gave me a look that, well, it wasn't inappropriate, but it wasn't neutral either. It was warm, almost tender, and somehow that made my lips curl into an involuntary smile. He smiled back, slow and genuine, the kind that crinkles the corners of a person's eyes. I've always believed you can tell more about someone from the way they look at you than from anything they say, and Edward's eyes had always carried a gentle sincerity. But today there was a subtlety to them, an unspoken understanding I couldn't quite place. I cleared my throat, suddenly aware that I was sitting amid a mess of scarves like a child digging through a toy chest. "I didn't hear you come in," I said. "Door was unlocked," he replied softly. "Your husband mentioned I could stop by to drop off his tools. I hope I didn't scare you." "No, not at all," I said, though my heart was beating faster than before. He stepped inside, not far, just enough that the dust motes drifting in the sunlight settled briefly on his shirt. He glanced around the room, taking it in the way someone might admire a painting they're not sure they're allowed to touch. His eyes returned to me, and something about that quiet attention felt surprisingly comforting. "Looks like I interrupted something important," he said, nodding toward the scarves. "Important might be a stretch," I laughed, picking up a faded teal one. "Just sorting through things I've held onto for too long." Edward took a few steps closer, slow and deliberate, never crossing into my space without permission. That was one of the things I admired about him. His awareness, his respect. He stopped a few feet away from me, hands tucked in his pockets, as if waiting to be invited into whatever small moment I was living in. "Let me guess," he said. "Each one has a memory?" "More than I realized," I admitted. "This one." I let the scarf drape over my hands. "My sister bought it for me when I turned 30. I haven't worn it in years, but every time I try to give it away, I feel like I'm letting a little piece of her go." Edward nodded, his expression softening. Some things stay with us for reasons we don't have to explain. It was such a simple sentence, but it landed deeper than he probably intended. I found myself watching him for a moment longer than was necessary. He had always carried himself with a quiet strength, no boastfulness, no need to impress. At 53, he had the kind of presence that comes from living enough life to know when words matter and when silence is kinder. I patted the bed beside me, motioning for him to sit, not too close, just near enough to talk without raising our voices. He hesitated only a second before taking the seat, careful not to disturb the folded scarves. The sunlight shifted as a cloud passed outside, and the room dimmed slightly, giving everything a softer hue. We talked about nothing and everything. about aging, about the small aches that show up without warning, about how strange it felt to still discover new things about ourselves after 50. At one point, he looked at me again with that warm, steady gaze. "You seem different today," he said quietly. "Lighter." I wasn't sure how to answer. Maybe it was the peacefulness of the afternoon, or maybe it was the safety I felt in his presence, but I found myself admitting something I hadn't said out loud to anyone. "I've been thinking a lot lately," I said, "about who I used to be and who I'm becoming. It's like I'm sifting through parts of myself the same way I'm sorting through these scarves." Edward didn't interrupt. He just listened, really listened, his attention anchored to my words as if nothing outside that room existed. And in that moment I felt seen, not as someone's wife, not as a woman navigating her 50s, but simply as Angela, a person with stories, thoughts, hopes, and quiet pieces still unfolding. When our conversation drifted into a comfortable silence, Edward glanced toward the window and then back at me. "I'm glad I stopped by," he said softly. So was I. Not because anything dramatic happened, not because there was romance or forbidden desire, but because it had been a long time since someone looked at me with such genuine presence, long enough that I'd forgotten how grounding it could feel. That afternoon, sitting beside him in the quiet of my bedroom, something subtle shifted inside me. A reminder that connection could be simple, gentle, unexpected, and sometimes just what a heart needs. I didn't know then that his visit would linger in my thoughts far longer than it should have, or that it was only the beginning. The rest of that day moved on quietly, yet something within me refused to settle. After Edward left, I lingered in the room longer than necessary, folding the scarves with a kind of absent-minded care. I kept replaying the look he'd given me, the soft attentiveness, the respect, the understanding. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't inappropriate, but it was meaningful in a way I had almost forgotten existed. By the time my husband returned home, the late afternoon had shifted into early evening, and the sunset painted the hallway walls in shades of orange and gold. He walked into the bedroom carrying grocery bags, talking about a sale he had spotted on canned peaches. I nodded and smiled at all the right places, but my mind was still drifting somewhere between that earlier moment and the present. I didn't tell him about Edward stopping by, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I didn't know how to explain the significance of something that wasn't quite an event, just a feeling, a moment of being seen. It seemed too delicate to put into words. The days that followed went on normally. I did my usual chores, tended to the small herb garden on the back deck, handled my remote bookkeeping tasks. But I found myself pausing more often, noticing things with a new sort of clarity. The warmth of the morning sun on the kitchen tiles, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the way I could hear the wind weaving through the cracks under the doors. Sometimes, when my thoughts drifted unexpectedly toward Edward, I felt a mix of confusion and curiosity. I wasn't longing for something new. I wasn't dissatisfied with my marriage. I wasn't craving drama or excitement. What I felt was far more subtle, like someone had brushed dust off a shelf inside me, revealing something I hadn't realized I'd neglected. A week later, on a soft Wednesday morning, it happened again. I was in the living room, sitting with a cup of chamomile tea, when I heard the rumble of a familiar truck in the driveway. I peeked through the curtains, and there he was, stepping out in his usual calm manner, carrying a wooden toolbox. My heart surprised me with a tiny flutter. My husband wasn't home. He had taken an early shift at the workshop, and I wouldn't see him until late afternoon. For a moment, I debated not answering the door, unsure why, exactly, but I quickly dismissed the thought. There was nothing to fear, and avoiding the moment would only make me feel foolish. When I opened the door, Edward greeted me with a polite smile. "Morning," he said, lifting the toolbox slightly. "Your husband asked me yesterday to take a look at the back gate. Said it keeps sticking." "Oh," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Yes, it's been stubborn for months." He walked through the foyer, heading toward the yard, and I followed him. The morning light made everything feel still and peaceful, the kind of calm that made even small interactions feel more intimate. As he inspected the gate, I found myself leaning against the porch rail, watching him work. There was something steadying about the way he focused, the way he moved with quiet confidence. Not rushed, not distracted, present. He glanced back at me once with a friendly expression. "It's an easy fix," he said. "Just needs the hinge realigned." I nodded, though my mind wasn't on the gate at all. When he finished, he wiped his hands on a cloth and looked out toward the trees at the edge of our yard. "You've got a peaceful place here," he said. "Quiet, feels grounding." "It is," I replied. "Sometimes I think it's more peaceful than I am." He turned his head slightly, giving me that same attentive expression he'd worn in the bedroom days earlier. "You've been thinking about things," he said gently. "I can tell." I hesitated before speaking. "I guess I have. More than usual." He nodded, not pushing, not asking, just acknowledging. That alone made the knot in my chest loosen. We stood there for a moment, letting the breeze carry the silence. And then he surprised me. "Angela," he said softly, "you don't have to explain anything to me, but I want you to know something." He paused, choosing his words with care. Sometimes life quiets down so much that we forget to check in with ourselves. And when someone finally notices a part of us we've overlooked, it can feel unsettling, even if it's innocent. The words settled into me like warm water. He wasn't implying anything. He wasn't crossing any lines. He was simply acknowledging what I couldn't bring myself to say out loud. I exhaled slowly. "You have this way," I said quietly, "of making people feel understood." Edward gave a small, almost shy smile. Maybe it's because I know what it feels like to be overlooked. There was a tenderness in that admission, something vulnerable, that caught me off guard. I didn't move closer, neither did he. But something between us shifted in that instant, becoming both clearer and more complicated. A connection, yes, but also a boundary neither of us intended to cross. Still, as he left a short while later, offering a gentle nod before driving off, I watched the dust trail behind his truck and knew that this wasn't the end of whatever was beginning to unfold. Not an affair, not a secret. Something quieter, something human, something that would continue to echo through the days ahead, whether I was ready or not. The next few days felt strangely suspended, as if time itself had slowed just enough for me to sense every shift in my own thoughts. I moved through my routines, laundry, bookkeeping, afternoon walks around the neighborhood. Yet there was a quiet awareness resting somewhere beneath the surface, like a small heartbeat I hadn't paid attention to in years. Edward's words kept echoing in my mind. Sometimes life quiets down so much that we forget to check in with ourselves. I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone had asked me how I was feeling, not out of courtesy, but out of genuine interest. And it wasn't that my husband didn't care. He simply lived in a world of doing rather than noticing, fixing rather than reflecting. We had fallen into a rhythm of partnership rather than emotional curiosity, something that worked well enough until something, or someone, made me aware of the quiet spaces between us. 2 more days passed before I saw Edward again. It was late afternoon when I heard the soft knock at the door. Not the hurried knuckles of delivery drivers, not the confident tap of my husband, but a gentle rhythm I recognized immediately. For a moment, I considered smoothing my hair, then mentally scolded myself for the impulse. When I opened the door, he stood there with a small brown paper bag in his hands. "I brought these for you," he said a little awkwardly. "My neighbor gave me too many pears from her tree, and I figured you might like some." The bag was warm against my palms when he handed it over, the sunlight catching the faint fuzz on the fruit. Something about the simple gesture, humble, thoughtful, unnecessary, made my chest tighten. "Thank you," I said softly. "That's very kind." He shrugged, as if embarrassed by the sincerity of the gesture. I was driving by anyway. We both knew he wasn't. I stepped back to invite him in, and he accepted with a polite nod. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon from a candle I'd lit earlier, and the late-day sun filtered through the living room curtains in long golden stripes. "Would you like some tea?" I asked. He hesitated, then gave a quiet smile. "Only if it's not too much trouble." I brewed 2 mugs of chamomile, letting the warm scent fill the kitchen as we moved around each other with a comfortable silence. When we sat at the small dining table, the atmosphere felt different, warmer, almost nostalgic, as if we were 2 old friends catching up after years apart, rather than 2 people tiptoeing around an unexpected connection. We talked about simple things at first. His work, my garden, the state of the weather. But gradually, something deeper unfolded, carried by the ease of the moment. "Do you ever miss who you used to be?" I asked, surprising even myself with the question. Edward looked at me slowly, thoughtfully. "Every now and then," he admitted, "but I think I miss the feeling more than the person." "What feeling?" "Possibility," he said, "the sense that you're still becoming someone." His answer settled into me like truth I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. "I think I've forgotten how to feel that," I whispered. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied my face with a gentleness that made me feel strangely vulnerable. Not exposed, just seen. As if he was looking directly at the version of me I'd misplaced along the way. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes possibility doesn't disappear. It just waits for us to notice it again." A soft hush filled the room. The ticking clock on the wall, the faint rustling of leaves outside, the warmth from the tea between my hands, all of it created a stillness that felt almost sacred. I found myself telling him things I hadn't told anyone, about how life had become predictable, how I sometimes felt like I was watching myself from outside my own body, moving through days with the same motions but not the same intention. I told him about small dreams I'd shelved, hobbies I'd abandoned, creativity I used to claim as easily as breathing. And he listened, not with pity, not with judgment, but with genuine interest. It had been so long since someone listened like that. At one point, I felt my eyes sting, not with sorrow, but with relief. Edward reached out instinctively, then paused, as if making sure it was welcome. His hand brushed lightly against mine, warm and steady. The touch wasn't charged or romantic. It was grounding, human, and somehow that made it even more meaningful. "Angela," he said softly, "you're allowed to rediscover yourself. At any age, for any reason. You don't need permission." I didn't realize how much I needed to hear those words until I felt the last bit of tension leave my shoulders. We sat like that for a long moment, not holding hands, just sharing a quiet space where nothing needed to be explained. Eventually, he withdrew his hand and leaned back slightly, giving me room to breathe again. "I didn't mean to overstep," he said. "You didn't," I replied. "Not at all." Outside, the sun had lowered to a warm orange glow, and the living room was wrapped in soft shadows. Edward finished the last sip of his tea, then gave a thoughtful nod. "I should head out," he said, "but I'm glad we talked." "So am I." He stood, offering a small, sincere smile that reached his eyes, and as he walked toward the door, I felt something shift once again. Not a boundary, not a line crossed, but a gentle unfolding inside me. A reminder that connection could change a life without ever breaking a rule. When the door closed behind him, I stood still for a long while, holding the warm memory of the moment like a newly discovered treasure, one I didn't yet know what to do with. But I knew this much. This wasn't the end. It was only the middle of something quietly transformative. ChatGPT said. Over the next several days, something inside me began to settle in a way that felt both new and strangely familiar. It was as if the conversations with Edward had loosened a long tightened knot, letting me breathe more deeply than I had in years. I didn't feel restless or conflicted. Instead, I felt awake, aware of myself in a way I had once been, long before routines became definitions and comfort turned into quiet numbness. I didn't see Edward for nearly a week after our talk over tea. Life resumed its normal rhythm, my husband heading off to work early each morning, me tending to chores and errands, evenings passing in predictable ways. Yet the stillness of the house seemed to hum with new questions, quiet ones, gentle ones, questions about who I was, not who I was supposed to be. One soft, overcast afternoon, the sky looking like brushed silver, I stepped outside to check on the herb garden. The air felt unusually cool for the season, carrying that earthy scent that comes before rain. As I clipped a few sprigs of rosemary, I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me. I didn't have to turn to know it was him. "Angela?" His voice was warm, careful, as if he wasn't sure whether he should even be there. I straightened and faced him. He stood near the gate he had repaired days earlier, one hand resting lightly on the latch. His expression was thoughtful, almost hesitant. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "You're not," I answered. "It's good to see you." He stepped into the yard, closing the gate behind him with a soft click. For a moment, we simply stood there, the breeze brushing between us, the leaves of the rosemary plant trembling lightly. There was nothing tense or complicated in the air, only a quiet sincerity that seemed to surround us every time we found ourselves in the same space. "I wasn't sure if I should come by," he said, looking down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "I didn't want to make things confusing for you." "You haven't," I said honestly. "If anything, you've helped me see things more clearly." He nodded slowly as if relieved. "I'm glad. That was never my intention, to make anything difficult." "I know," I replied. "You've only been kind." We walked toward the back porch together, not touching, but moving in an unspoken rhythm. I gestured for him to sit on the wooden bench near the wall, and he settled with his hands resting loosely in his lap. I sat beside him, leaving a respectful space between us. It felt natural, comfortable. For a few minutes, we said nothing. The world seemed impossibly quiet. A lone bird singing somewhere in the trees, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a passing car. Finally, he broke the silence. "You seem different," he said gently. "More present." "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I replied. "Not about you, Mel, not only about you. Mostly about myself." He offered a small, understanding smile. "That's good. You deserve that time." "I think I forgot that somewhere along the way," I said. "I forgot that I'm still allowed to grow, to want things, to feel things deeply, even if they don't fit neatly into the life I've built." Edward looked ahead, his gaze fixed on the yard. "You know, we spend so much time trying to be steady for others that we forget to check whether we're steady within ourselves." His words settled between us like truth, the kind that doesn't cut but clarifies. "I'm grateful for you, Edward," I said, "not because of anything dramatic, but because you reminded me that I'm still a whole person underneath everything else." He turned his head, studying my face with that familiar gentleness. "And I'm grateful for you, Angela. You've reminded me that quiet connections can matter just as much as loud ones." The breeze picked up, carrying the scent of rain. A soft rumble of distant thunder rolled over the sky. Neither of us moved to go inside. "I want you to know," he said softly, "that I respect your life, your marriage, your boundaries. Whatever this connection is, it doesn't need to cross any lines to mean something." "I know," I whispered, and I did, because what lay between us wasn't desire or longing. It was recognition. Human recognition. The kind that rarely happens unexpectedly, and even more rarely arrives without complication. A few raindrops began to fall, tapping lightly on the wooden deck. I stood, and he followed. We walked to the edge of the porch, standing together as the rain began to fall in earnest, washing the air clean. "Will we see each other again?" I asked, not to trap him in an answer, but to acknowledge the truth, that his presence had changed something in me. "Of course," he said softly, "but I think what matters most now is what you do for yourself." I nodded, feeling his words settle like warm stones in my chest. "I think I know where to start." He gave a small, gentle smile, the kind that felt like a quiet blessing. Then he stepped down from the porch and walked toward the gate, pausing once to look back. "Take care of yourself, Angela," he said. "I will," I replied. And then he was gone, the gate clicking softly behind him, his figure disappearing down the rain-slicked path. I stayed there for a long while, letting the cool air settle against my skin, letting the moment sink into the corners of my heart. I felt no longing, no regret, only clarity, a sense of being reconnected to myself, as if the woman I used to be had finally reached out her hand again. Later that evening, as the house filled with the familiar sounds of my husband returning home, I realized something important. I wasn't searching for something outside my life. I was rediscovering something inside it, inside me, that I had unintentionally set aside. Edward's presence had simply struck a match in a dark room. The light, though small, was mine to decide what to do with. And for the first time in years, I felt ready to move toward my own reflection, not with fear, but with understanding, honesty, and a quiet sense of possibility that belonged entirely to me. The story didn't end with him. It began with me.